I never planned to carry the weight of two households on my shoulders. It just happened. One small favor turned into a routine, and that routine became my life. 7 years. 7 long years of paying bills that weren't mine. Electricity, rent, medicine, groceries. Every month, without fail, my salary would vanish before I even saw it. Not because I was careless, but because I loved my parents. Or at least I thought I did, the way they wanted to be loved. I was 26 when it started. Freshly married, working long hours in a small accounting firm. My husband and I were still learning what stability meant. And then one day, my mom called. Her voice trembled through the phone. "Beta, we're a little short this month. Can you help us just this once?" Just once. Those 2 words can change everything. I sent the money that same evening. It felt good, like I was doing something meaningful. After all, they'd raised me. They'd sacrificed for me. This was my turn to give back, right? But once became every month. And every month came with a new reason. The gas bill went up. The car needed repairs. Dad's medicine was expensive. The fridge broke again. It was never ending. And somehow, I didn't stop to think that I was the only one holding everything together. They never asked how I was doing. Never asked if I was saving for my own child's future or if my job was exhausting me. The conversations were always about them. And I convinced myself that was okay. That's what good daughters do. They don't question. They don't complain. They just give. Sometimes my husband would glance at me quietly as I transferred another payment. He never said it out loud, but his eyes did. When will this end? I didn't know how to answer him. Because deep down, I was scared to stop. Scared they'd think I didn't love them anymore. That's the kind of emotional trap love can become. It doesn't shout. It whispers. It convinces you that sacrifice is the same as affection. That guilt is a form of gratitude. Years passed like pages in a book I didn't remember writing. My parents' needs grew while mine faded. And somewhere between invoices and late-night work shifts, I forgot who I was beyond being their provider. I'd visit them on weekends, carrying groceries, paying bills, fixing things around the house. Mom would smile and say, "You're such a good daughter." Dad would nod in approval, and that approval, that tiny nod, kept me going. But sometimes when I sat in my car afterward, I'd just stare at the steering wheel and wonder, when was the last time they did something for me? The silence that followed was always my answer. Still, I told myself I was doing the right thing, that this was love, that one day they'd see all my sacrifices and be proud. But love built on debt doesn't stay pure. It becomes a transaction, one that only goes one way. 7 years. That's how long it took for me to realize I was the only one still trying. And it wasn't love that kept me there anymore. It was guilt. Guilt that I wasn't enough. Guilt that I might fail them. Guilt that being happy on my own somehow made me selfish. But I had no idea, none at all, that the day I finally asked for something back, the illusion would crumble faster than I could imagine. Because when I needed them, truly needed them, they said 6 words that changed everything. Do it yourself. Not our job. Life had settled into a pattern that looked steady from the outside, but felt hollow on the inside. Every day began the same way. The alarm before sunrise, the rush to get breakfast ready, my son's uniform folded neatly on the chair, and the quiet hum of the coffee machine that somehow felt louder than my thoughts. My husband would leave early for his shift, and I'd handle the rest. Packing lunches, checking emails, dropping my son to school, and driving straight to work. My world revolved around lists, bills to pay, groceries to buy, transfers to make, promises to keep. I was moving constantly, but going nowhere. My parents called often, not to ask how I was. That part had faded years ago, but to remind me about something that needed paying. "Beta, the gas bill came again. Can you handle it today?" "The car's insurance is due, don't forget." "We need a few things from the market. I'll text you the list." There was never malice in their tone. Just expectation, as if this was how things were supposed to be. As if my life existed to keep theirs running smoothly. I didn't argue. I just said, "Sure, I'll take care of it." Because that's what I always said. That's what I'd trained myself to say. At work, I smiled at colleagues, submitted reports on time, and pretended everything was fine. But the truth was, I was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix, but the kind that seeps into your bones. The kind that makes you forget what joy feels like. Every payday followed the same rhythm. I'd sit at my desk during lunch, open my banking app, and start dividing what was already too little. Rent, groceries, my parents' bills, my son's school fee. By the time I was done, my account was almost empty. And still, I'd breathe a sigh of relief. Not because I had enough, but because at least everyone else did. My husband tried to talk to me once. "You don't have to do everything, you know," he said gently. "They're adults. They can manage some things on their own." I looked at him and smiled, the kind of smile that hides exhaustion behind politeness. "They've done enough for me. This is my way of thanking them." He didn't push further, but I could feel the distance growing, quietly, like dust on furniture you stop noticing. Weekends weren't much different. I'd drive to my parents' house with bags of groceries, pay whatever bills they'd collected over the week, and fix things around the house. Mom would talk about her favorite TV shows, Dad would complain about his knees, and in between, they'd mention something else they needed. "You know, the washing machine's acting up again. The electricity unit's so high this month. Maybe you can talk to someone about it." It was always said casually, but it was never casual. Every word carried weight, a silent reminder that I was their safety net. Once, when I was leaving after another long Sunday, my mom hugged me and said, "You're such a blessing, Beta." "Not everyone gets a daughter like you," I smiled, holding back the sting in my throat. But as I drove home, I couldn't help thinking, love shouldn't feel like debt being repaid. My own life was slipping through the cracks. I missed my son's school events because of double shifts. I skipped dinners because of fatigue. And when I finally lay in bed at night staring at the ceiling, I realized I had become invisible in my own story. There were no arguments, no fights, just quiet imbalance. I was the giver. They were the receivers. And the world had accepted that equation without question. But deep inside, something small had started to change. A quiet awareness that maybe love isn't supposed to feel this heavy. I didn't know it then, but that quiet awareness would soon become a storm. The kind that would change everything. It happened slowly, the way walls begin to crack long before they collapse. At first, it was just small things. A sigh from my mother when I couldn't visit on a weekday. A sharp tone from my father when a payment was delayed by a single day. Little things that shouldn't have hurt but somehow did. I remember one Friday evening when I called to tell them I might not make it that weekend. My son had caught a cold and I wanted to stay home with him. My mom's response was quiet but heavy. "Oh, I see. I guess we'll manage somehow. I just thought family comes first." Her words lingered long after the call ended, not because they were harsh, but because they were designed to sting. That was how they operated, not with shouting, but with silence, guilt, and carefully chosen words that made me feel small for choosing myself. Another time, Dad called in the middle of my workday. "Beta, the electricity bill's overdue again," he said, a trace of annoyance in his voice. "I'll pay it tonight," I replied softly. There was a pause. Then he added, "You really should be more responsible about these things." I stared at the phone in disbelief. Responsible? For their bills? But I didn't say anything. I just smiled weakly, hung up, and went back to typing reports that suddenly felt meaningless. It became a pattern. My efforts taken for granted, my presence expected, my absence criticized. Gratitude slowly faded from our conversations, replaced by complaints. "You sent less this month. Why don't you call more often? Your husband must not like helping us." Each sentence chipped away at the picture-perfect idea I had of my parents, the ones I'd admired, protected, and loved so fiercely. Now they sounded like people keeping score. And yet every time I felt anger rising, guilt followed. I'd remind myself, they raised you. They gave you everything. But if they gave me everything, why did I always feel like I owed them more? Sometimes I'd remember flashes from childhood, things I'd buried under the label of strict parenting. Like when I got my first job at 19 and proudly handed my first paycheck to my father. He didn't smile. He just nodded and said, It's about time you contribute. No hug, no I'm proud of you. Just expectation disguised as normal. Or the time I wanted to move out after marriage, and my mother cried for days saying, "If you leave, what will people say? That you abandoned us?" So I didn't move too far. I stayed close. Close enough to help, close enough to be called at any hour. Looking back, I realized I'd been trained to feel guilty for wanting a life of my own. Their love had always come with a price tag, invisible but heavy. At family gatherings, my mother would brag about how I took care of everything. "She's our little hero," she'd say proudly, while I stood beside her smiling, pretending not to feel the hollow space behind those words. Because being their hero didn't mean they respected my sacrifices. It meant they expected me never to stop. The more I gave, the less they saw it as kindness. It became an obligation, my duty, my role. And slowly a quiet resentment began to build in me. I noticed it when I started avoiding their calls, when I'd wait a few minutes before opening their messages, when I'd sigh before sending another transfer. It wasn't hatred. It was exhaustion wrapped in silence. But I didn't confront them, not yet. I still believed that maybe one day they'd surprise me, call just to ask how I was doing, or say thank you without adding a new request at the end. That day never came. Instead, something far smaller, far simpler, would finally break the surface. A single moment of need. A request from me after 7 years of saying yes to everything. And the answer I got would make me realize just how one-sided love can become when gratitude dies. It was a Thursday morning. One of those chaotic, breathless days where everything seems to go wrong at once. My boss had called an emergency meeting at the office. My babysitter had fallen sick, and my son had a mild fever that made his small, tired eyes cling to me as if I was the only safe thing left in the world. For once, I couldn't do it all. For once, I needed help. I remember standing in the kitchen, phone in hand, rehearsing the words before calling my parents. They had always said, "Family helps family." I believed that, or maybe I just wanted to. When my mother picked up, I tried to sound calm. "Ami, could you please watch him for a few hours today? I've got an urgent meeting and no one else can." There was silence on the other end, followed by a small sigh. "Oh, today?" she said softly. "That's really not a good time. Your father and I were planning to visit Aunt Samina. She's expecting us." I pressed the phone tighter to my ear. "I understand, but it's just for 3 hours. I'll drop him off and pick him right up." "Please, Ami." "I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important." Her voice hardened slightly. "You really should plan these things better, Beta. We can't keep adjusting our lives every time something happens with your work." "Every time?" I blinked, stunned. This was the first time I'd ever asked. Then my father's voice entered the background, muffled but sharp. "What's she asking now?" My mother responded, not quietly enough. "She wants us to babysit again." Again, as if I'd asked 100 times before. Then he said it, words that still echo years later. "Tell her we're not her servants. She's a mother now. She should act like one." Something inside me broke. I didn't hang up right away. I stood there staring at the wall, my son coughing softly in the next room. My mother tried to cover the silence. "You know how your father is. Don't take it personally. We just have our plans today." Plans. That was all I was. An inconvenience to their plans. I whispered, "It's okay," though my voice trembled so badly I could barely recognize it. I ended the call, set the phone down, and just stood there, frozen between shock and realization. For years, I'd dropped everything for them, canceled meetings, driven through rain, spent nights in hospitals, managed their bills, their medicines, their comfort. And when I needed 3 hours, I was asking too much. My hands shook as I held my son close, whispering, "It's okay, sweetheart. Mama's here." But inside, I knew something had shifted forever. That day, the image I had of my parents, kind, selfless, loving, shattered into something colder, something real. Change, especially the kind that shakes the foundation of a family, arrives slowly, quietly, like winter creeping in after a long summer. Weeks passed before I started noticing the difference in their tone. At first, it was subtle. My father's calls became shorter, my mother's laughter less frequent. Then one evening, she called me, her voice trembling just slightly. "Beta, do you know when the gas company sends the bill?" "I think they missed ours." I knew they hadn't. They just hadn't paid it. "I'm not sure," I said gently. "You can check the app, Ami. It's easy." "Oh," she said, fumbling for words. "You know I'm not good with these things." I smiled to myself, not out of cruelty, but realization. For years, I'd made sure they never had to learn. I had made life too easy. Now, without me holding everything together, the cracks began to show. Their electricity got cut off for 2 days. Their internet plan expired. And suddenly, my father, the man who once said, "She's not our servant," called to ask if I could just help him out this one time. I didn't say no. I just didn't rush. "I'll see what I can do," I said calmly. But things are tight right now. The silence that followed was heavy. For the first time, he was the one waiting. A week later, my cousin mentioned that my parents hadn't shown up to a family dinner. Apparently, they were keeping to themselves lately. That was when it hit me. They were finally living the life they'd unknowingly handed me for years. Quiet, lonely, stretched thin, pretending everything was fine. It wasn't revenge I felt, not anymore. It was clarity. They were facing the weight of their choices. The consequences of a love they had measured in bills and favors instead of care and gratitude. When my mother finally came to visit, she brought homemade food, something she hadn't done in years. She placed the container on my kitchen counter, smiling nervously. "You've lost weight," she said softly. "Are you eating well?" I nodded, polite, distant. "I'm fine, Ami, thank you." We sat in silence for a while. Her eyes wandered around my small apartment, the toys on the floor, the stack of bills on the table, the smell of coffee lingering in the air. For once, she seemed to see my life, not as a background to her own, but as its own world. After a few minutes, she whispered, "You've been busy. We didn't realize how much you did for us." There it was, the sentence I'd been waiting to hear my entire life. But instead of joy, all I felt was calm detachment. I smiled kindly and said, "It's okay. You don't have to say anything." Because the truth was, I didn't need their apology anymore. They were already living it. The bills, the silence, the absence, it all taught them what my presence once meant. And though I never raised my voice, never sought revenge and cruelty, they finally understood. Sometimes the loudest payback is found in peace, the kind that comes when you finally stop running after people who were never running toward you. Their world was quieter now, smaller, and for the first time, I didn't feel guilty about it. Because I wasn't part of it anymore. I had built my own. It was a Sunday afternoon, quiet, still, deceptively peaceful. The kind of day that usually meant tea and lazy conversation. But that day, the knock on my door carried weight. When I opened it, my parents stood there. Both looked smaller somehow, not in size but in spirit. My father's posture wasn't as firm, my mother's eyes weren't as sharp. They stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, as if the air between us still remembered what it used to be. I made tea out of habit, muscle memory from a life I had outgrown. We sat at the table in silence, the only sound the faint clink of cups. Finally, my father spoke. "What happened to you?" he asked, not with anger but confusion. "You've changed. You don't call, you don't come by, you don't help anymore. We barely see you." His words should have hurt. Once they would have. But now they just felt delayed, 7 years too late. I looked at them, really looked. At the parents I had loved, feared, served, and tried endlessly to please. Then I took a slow breath. "I didn't change," I said softly. "I just stopped pretending." My mother frowned. "Pretending?" "Yes," I said. "Pretending that everything was okay. Pretending that love was one-sided and that it was fine. Pretending that I didn't notice how my worth in this family depended on what I could do, not who I was." My voice was calm but steady, every word anchored in 7 years of buried exhaustion. "I paid your bills, your loans, your groceries. I gave up things I needed so you could have what you wanted. And I never complained because I thought that's what love was, more giving until it hurt. They stayed quiet. I continued. But the day I needed something, just once, you said, "It's not our job." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. My mother's eyes welled up, but I didn't stop. I didn't ask for money or comfort or anything big. I asked for a few hours, a favor from the two people I thought would always be there for me. And that's when I realized, you never saw me as family. You saw me as convenience. My father's mouth opened slightly, as if to speak, but I lifted my hand gently. "Please, let me finish." They fell silent. For years, I told myself you were tired or old or just didn't know how to show love. I made excuses because the truth hurt too much. But that day, you showed me exactly how you felt. I looked down at my hands, steady now, not trembling like before. So no, I didn't change out of anger. I changed out of survival, because I finally understood that love shouldn't feel like debt. And I was done paying. The room went still. Even the ticking of the clock felt louder. My mother wiped her eyes and whispered, "We didn't mean it that way." "I know," I said gently. "But you did mean it. And that's enough." They looked at me, lost, maybe even ashamed. But I didn't feel victorious. This wasn't revenge. It was release. I wasn't that desperate, approval-seeking daughter anymore. I was someone who had learned that peace sometimes looks like distance. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back. "I'll always wish you well," I said softly. "But I can't go back to being the person you only loved when she was useful." My father's eyes glistened for the first time I could remember. He nodded, a small, silent acknowledgement that said everything words couldn't. As they left, my mother turned at the door and whispered, "You've grown strong." I smiled faintly. "No," I said. "I just stopped being weak." And with that, the door closed, not in anger, but in finality. The chapter that had defined my life for 7 years quietly ended. And for the first time, I wasn't holding on to pain. I was holding on to myself. The days that followed felt strangely calm. No more constant calls about bills. No more late-night guilt trips. No more trying to earn love that should have been freely given. At first, the silence felt unfamiliar, almost hollow. I would catch myself reaching for my phone, expecting a message or a reminder, only to realize there was none. But soon that silence became comforting. It wasn't emptiness anymore. It was peace. I started focusing on things I'd ignored for years. Little things that made me feel alive. Morning walks with my son, laughter echoing through the park. Cooking dinner without checking my phone every 5 minutes. Reading books just because I wanted to, not because I needed to escape. Life was simple again. And for the first time, it was mine. Sometimes I'd think about them, my parents, not with bitterness, but with a quiet ache. I knew they missed me. Not just my help, but my presence. The constant warmth I used to bring to their house. The daughter who never said no. Because once I stepped away, they were left with everything they'd demanded. Independence, pride, control. But none of the love that held it all together. A cousin mentioned once that my parents seemed different lately. More subdued, more withdrawn. "They talk about you a lot," she said softly. "But they don't know how to reach out." I smiled sadly. Maybe some lessons take time to sink in. It wasn't that I didn't forgive them. I did, quietly in my own way. But forgiveness didn't mean returning to the same old cycle. Forgiveness for me meant letting go of what hurt without reopening the door that caused it. Every now and then, I'd get a text from my mother, a simple, "How are you?" Or, "Your father isn't feeling well today." And I would reply, kindly, respectfully, but without losing myself in their needs. Boundaries. Something I never knew I was allowed to have. And in those small, steady boundaries, I found strength, because healing doesn't always come with apologies. Sometimes it comes with acceptance. Accepting that people love the way they know how, even if it isn't enough for you. I had spent 7 years pouring from an empty cup. Now I was finally refilling it, drop by drop, moment by moment. My home was filled with laughter again. Not forced, not hidden behind exhaustion. real, unfiltered laughter that came from freedom. And though a small part of me would always wish my parents had chosen love over pride, I knew one thing for sure. They finally understood what I'd been giving all along. Not money, not help, but presence. And once it was gone, they realized its worth, far too late to reclaim it. As I watched my son fall asleep one evening, his small hand clutching mine, I whispered, "I'll teach you love differently." Not the kind that drains, but the kind that fills. Because pain, when faced with honesty, becomes wisdom. And mine had finally turned into peace. Looking back now, I don't see myself as a victim anymore. I see a woman who gave everything she had, time, money, patience, love, and finally learned that giving doesn't mean losing. It only means you have a heart that still knows how to care, even after being broken. For 7 long years, I confused love with sacrifice. I thought being a good daughter meant saying yes to everything, carrying everyone's weight, and never asking for help in return. But love without respect isn't love. It's control wrapped in obligation. True love, the kind that heals, doesn't demand you to shrink so others can shine. It doesn't ask you to give until you disappear. It meets you halfway. I learned that boundaries aren't walls, they're doors with locks. And you get to choose who walks through them and how often. When I stopped pouring into people who only took, I didn't lose love. I found it. In myself, in my son, in the small, quiet life we built from the ashes of exhaustion. I no longer feel guilty for saying no. Because no is not unkind. Sometimes it's the most loving thing you can say, to protect your peace, your energy, your heart. And as much as it hurt to see my parents through clearer eyes, I know now that I can love them from afar, without letting their needs drown my own. That's not coldness. That's maturity. If there's one thing I'd tell anyone watching this, it's this. Don't mistake loyalty for love. Don't let guilt become your language of care. And never let anyone convince you that your worth is measured by how much you can give them. You deserve relationships where kindness flows both ways, where your presence is valued, not used. Because love that only takes will eventually leave you empty. But love that respects will fill you in ways you never thought possible. And if you've ever been in my place, tired, unappreciated, and quietly breaking, I want you to know this. You're allowed to stop trying to fix people who enjoy seeing you bend. You're allowed to choose yourself. That isn't revenge. That's healing. That's freedom. And as I watch my son grow, I remind myself every day that the love I give him will never make him feel like he owes me his life. Because love, real love, doesn't keep score. It gives and lets you breathe. That's the lesson I learned. And it's the reason I'll never let anyone make me small again.